I moved into the small flat on Wycliffe Road with a sense of eager anticipation. The year was 1956, and London had begun to recover from the war's devastation. The city buzzed with a new kind of life, a promise of better days. My new home was modest, but it was mine, a place where I could carve out a life for myself. I was just starting out as a secretary for a small law firm, and the flat was conveniently located near the office. Everything seemed perfect until the knocking started. It was a subtle thing at first, a light tap 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 at the edge of my consciousness. I chalked it up to the sounds of the old building settling, the pipes creaking, or perhaps a neighbor's late-night movements. But the knocks persisted, becoming more insistent, more purposeful, until I couldn't ignore them anymore. They always came in threes, tap tap tap, as if someone or something was announcing its presence. It was unnerving, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a draft causing the doors to rattle, or perhaps an animal trapped in the walls. But deep down, I knew something was off. The atmosphere in the flat began to change. The air felt heavier, colder, and I found myself feeling watched, even when I was alone. Then things began to move. It started with small objects. My hairbrush would be in a different spot on the dresser, or a book would be lying open on the floor when I was certain I had left it on the shelf. At first, I doubted myself. Maybe I had been careless, not paying attention. But as the days went by, the movements became more deliberate, more sinister. One night, I returned home late after staying behind at the office to finish some paperwork. I was exhausted, my head swimming with numbers and legal jargon. All I wanted was to collapse into bed and let sleep take me. But as I entered my bedroom, I froze. The air was frigid, like a deep winter chill, and every hair on my body stood on end. There, in the middle of the floor, lay a shattered mirror. I hadn't heard it break, but the glass was scattered in every direction, sparkling in the dim light. I stood there, rooted to the spot, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then the knocking began again. Tap, tap, tap. Louder this time, more insistent, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, surrounding me. I backed out of the room, heart pounding, breath catching in my throat. The knocking followed me down the hall, echoing through the flat like a pulse. In a panic, I reached for the front door, desperate to flee. But as my hand closed around the doorknob, it twisted violently in my grasp and slammed shut with a force that sent me stumbling backward. I fell to the floor, gasping for breath, the cold seeping into my bones. The knocking continued, relentless, almost mocking. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, trying to find a way to escape. But there was no escaping it. This thing, whatever it was, had me trapped. I spent the night huddled in the corner of the living room, too afraid to move, too afraid to close my eyes. The knocking continued for hours, rhythmic and unyielding, until it suddenly stopped, leaving the flat in an eerie, oppressive silence. When morning finally came, I left the flat as soon as I could, making my way to the office in a daze. I didn't mention the events of the night to anyone. I didn't want to sound insane. But the memory of the mirror, the cold, the knocking, it all haunted me throughout the day. I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to find help. That evening, I sought out a local priest, hoping for some kind of blessing, some words of comfort. He listened to my story with a furrowed brow, his face growing more somber with each passing detail. When I finished, he crossed himself and said a prayer for me, but I could see the fear in his eyes. He told me to stay strong, to have faith, but there was an edge to his voice that made my blood run cold. That night, the knocking returned. This time it was accompanied by a low, guttural whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It was calling my name, and as I lay there, frozen in fear, I felt the icy grip of something unseen brush against my skin, sending a shock of terror through me. I wasn't just dealing with a poltergeist. This thing, this malevolent presence, had a personal vendetta against me, and I had no idea why. But one thing was clear, it wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted, and I was too terrified to find out what that was. I spent the following days in a state of constant dread. The events of that night had left me shaken, my nerves frayed to the point where every creak, every gust of wind outside my window set my heart racing. I could no longer convince myself that it was just the old flat or my imagination playing tricks. The entity in my home was real, and it was becoming more aggressive. The day after the mirror shattered, I noticed bruises forming on my arms and legs, dark purple marks that I couldn't explain. My thoughts turned to that chilling touch I had felt, the icy fingers that had grazed my skin. Had it been stronger than I realized? Was it now leaving physical marks on me? I tried to stay away from the flat as much as possible, spending long hours at the office or wandering the streets of London, but I couldn't avoid it forever. Each evening, I found myself returning, the fear gnawing at me as I climbed the stairs to my door. The flat loomed before me like a beast waiting to pounce. One evening, a week after the knocking began, I returned home to find the flat in complete disarray. Furniture had been overturned, drawers pulled out, and their contents strewn across the floor. My clothes were ripped from the wardrobe, torn to shreds as if by an animal. The air was thick with the scent of something foul, something rotting. Panic surged through me, and I rushed to the kitchen, grabbing the phone with shaking hands. I needed help, anyone who could make sense of this madness. I dialed the number of a local paranormal investigator I had heard about, a man who was rumored to have dealt with spirits and hauntings. I could barely keep my voice steady as I explained the situation, pleading with him to come as soon as possible. The investigator, a grizzled man with a hard look in his eyes, arrived that night. He carried with him an array of strange tools and a sense of calm that I envied. As he walked through the flat, he muttered prayers under his breath, his gaze sharp as he examined the walls, the floors, the air itself. He didn't flinch when he saw the damage, nor when he noticed the bruises on my skin. "This isn't just a poltergeist," he finally said, his voice low and grave. "It's something far more malevolent. It's targeting you, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants." I felt a cold wave of fear wash over me. "What does it want?" I whispered, my throat dry, barely able to force the words out. He didn't answer right away, instead walking over to the shattered mirror that still lay on the bedroom floor. He picked up a shard of glass, inspecting it carefully, then looked back at me with a seriousness that made my stomach drop. "It's trying to break you," he said. "To wear you down, make you vulnerable. This kind of entity feeds on fear, on suffering. The more scared you are, the stronger it becomes." His words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The realization that I was being toyed with, that this thing was feeding off my terror, made my skin crawl. "What do I do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "How do I stop it?" The investigator considered this for a moment before answering. "You need to fight back. Show it that you won't be broken, that you're not afraid. If you give in to the fear, it will consume you. But if you stand your ground, it might just lose its power." His words were easier said than done. The thought of confronting this entity, of standing up to something I couldn't even see, filled me with dread. But what choice did I have? The investigator stayed with me that night, performing a cleansing ritual in the flat, filling the air with the scent of burning sage. He spoke in low tones, reciting prayers and incantations that I didn't understand but clung to with every fiber of my being. For a few hours, the flat was silent. The air felt lighter, less oppressive. I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, the worst was over. But that hope was short-lived. Around midnight, as the investigator prepared to leave, the temperature in the flat dropped suddenly. The cold was so intense that my breath came out in visible puffs. The investigator stiffened, his eyes narrowing as he looked around. "It's still here," he murmured, more to himself than to me. "And it's angry." Before I could react, the knocking returned. Loud, insistent, echoing through the flat with a force that rattled the windows. The investigator turned to me, his expression grim. "Whatever happens, don't show fear," he said, his voice firm. "It's testing you." But how could I not be afraid? The knocking grew louder, more violent, as if the very walls were about to cave in. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, the tension in the air so thick that it felt like a weight pressing down on me. I held my breath, waiting, listening, and then, without warning, the flat was plunged into darkness. The lights flickered and went out, leaving us in pitch black. I could hear the investigator muttering under his breath, trying to light a candle, but his voice was drowned out by a new sound, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Something was in the room with us. I could feel it, the air around me growing colder, the sensation of being watched, of being hunted. I backed away, my hands outstretched, feeling for the wall behind me. The growling grew louder, closer, and I could sense the presence of something enormous, something malevolent, closing in on me. Suddenly, I felt a sharp pain in my side, as if something had slashed me with claws. I cried out, stumbling backward, clutching my side as warm blood seeped through my fingers. The investigator was at my side in an instant, shining the beam of his flashlight around the room, but there was nothing to see. The growling had stopped, the presence gone as quickly as it had appeared. But the damage was done. As I looked down at my side, I saw 3 deep scratches, blood oozing from the fresh wounds. The investigator's face was pale, his expression one of disbelief. "This is far worse than I thought," he said quietly, his voice tinged with fear. "It's marked you. It's not going to stop until it gets what it wants." The realization that I was now physically marked by this entity filled me with a terror that I couldn't push down. The investigator stayed with me the rest of the night, keeping vigil as I tried to sleep, but rest didn't come. My mind was a whirl of fear and confusion, and the darkness seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with its weight. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't going to stop, and I had no idea how to fight it. The days that followed were a blur of terror and exhaustion. The flat, once a sanctuary, had become a prison, a place where every shadow held a threat, where every sound was a reminder that I was no longer alone. The investigator had promised to return with reinforcements, but he cautioned me against staying in the flat alone. Yet I felt trapped, as though leaving would be giving in to the entity's game. So I stayed, and the haunting continued. The bruises on my body darkened and multiplied, and the scratches on my side refused to heal. Every night, the knocking would start, louder and more violent, as if trying to batter down my defenses. The low growling returned too, echoing through the flat like the voice of a beast lurking just out of sight. It wasn't long before I began to hear whispers, incoherent at first, but soon forming words that chilled me to the bone. Leave or suffer. The voice was a harsh whisper, barely more than a breath, but it was filled with malice. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, wrapping around me like a shroud. I tried to block it out, to cover my ears and hum to drown out the sound, but it was relentless, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Then the entity escalated its torment. One night, as I lay in bed, the sheets were suddenly yanked off me with a force that sent them flying across the room. I shot up, heart hammering in my chest, and saw to my horror that the blankets were hanging in midair, suspended by some invisible force. They twisted and writhed as though alive before dropping to the floor in a heap. I scrambled out of bed, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was freezing, the air so cold that it burned my lungs. The darkness seemed to press in on me, heavy and oppressive, and the knocking began again, this time right above my head. I looked up, and for the first time, I saw it. A figure, or the shadow of one, loomed in the corner of the ceiling, just beyond the reach of the dim light from the street lamp outside. It was an amorphous shape, darker than the surrounding night, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch out toward me. Its face was a blur, a void where features should have been, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was frozen in place, locked in the entity's gaze. The shadow moved, descending slowly from the ceiling, its limbs elongating, reaching for me. The closer it came, the more intense the cold became, until it felt like knives slicing through my flesh. The voice returned, louder now, almost a roar. Leave or suffer. The words echoed in my mind, a command that rattled my thoughts, but I couldn't move, couldn't even blink. The entity was so close now that I could feel its breath on my skin, a fetid, rancid air that made me gag. Then, without warning, it lunged at me. A force like a sledgehammer slammed into my chest, sending me crashing to the floor. Pain exploded through my body, and I gasped for breath. The air knocked out of me. The shadow loomed over me, its limbs wrapping around my throat, squeezing with an unimaginable strength. I clawed at the air, desperate to free myself, but my hands passed through the shadow as if it were made of smoke. My vision began to blur, black spots dancing before my eyes. I was suffocating, the entity's grip tightening, crushing the life out of me. Just as I thought I couldn't take any more, the pressure suddenly released, and I was left gasping on the floor, my throat burning, my body trembling uncontrollably. The shadow receded, melting back into the darkness of the ceiling, leaving me in a heap on the cold floor. I could still feel its presence, lingering, watching, waiting for its next move. The words it had whispered replayed in my mind over and over, a cruel reminder that I was at its mercy. The investigator returned the next day, this time with a small team of paranormal experts. They brought equipment I didn't recognize, strange devices that beeped and flashed, cameras that recorded in the dark, and various religious artifacts. They worked quickly, setting up their gear throughout the flat, their faces grim and focused. They spent hours investigating, asking questions, recording every knock, every whisper. They sprinkled holy water in every corner, chanted prayers, and burned incense that filled the air with a pungent smoke. But as night fell, the atmosphere in the flat grew thick with tension. It was as if the entity was waiting for something, biding its time, gathering strength. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the knocking started again. This time it was more than just knocks. The walls trembled with the force, and the floor beneath our feet seemed to shudder. The temperature plummeted, and the oppressive cold returned, seeping into our bones. The investigators exchanged nervous glances, their confidence visibly shaken. Then came the whispers, harsh guttural voices that seemed to rise from the very walls. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, violent, threatening. The words grew louder, a cacophony of voices that reverberated through the flat, filling every corner with their malevolent sound. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. The investigators scrambled to turn on their equipment, their flashlights cutting through the blackness, but the beams seemed weak, almost swallowed by the dark. And then, just as before, the shadow appeared. This time it wasn't alone. Multiple figures emerged from the walls, their forms indistinct but undeniably human in shape, their limbs unnaturally long, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded us, closing in with a terrifying speed, their whispers rising to a fever pitch. The investigators tried to fend them off, holding up crosses, chanting prayers, but it was no use. The entities pressed forward, their cold fingers brushing against our skin, leaving trails of icy pain in their wake. I was cornered, backed into a corner with nowhere to run, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. One of the figures lunged at me, its hand outstretched, and as it made contact, a searing pain shot through my body. I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat, but it was lost in the chaos around me. The investigator shouted something, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of the entities. I could barely see him, could barely think, as the shadow figures swarmed us. I felt their hands on me, dragging me down, pulling me toward the floor as if trying to drag me into the darkness itself. The cold was unbearable, freezing me from the inside out, and the whispers filled my mind, drowning out all thought. And then just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The figures vanished, the whispers ceased, and the flat was plunged into an eerie silence. I lay on the floor, trembling, barely able to catch my breath. The investigators were scattered around the room, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock. But the worst was yet to come. As I struggled to sit up, my body aching from the attack, and saw it, the final mark. Carved into the floorboards where I had fallen was a symbol, an intricate design that pulsed with a faint sickly glow. I didn't recognize it, but the terror it inspired was undeniable. The investigator crawled over to me, his face ashen as he stared at the symbol. "This is bad," he muttered, his voice shaking. "This is very bad." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes filled with fear. "It's a binding mark," he said. "It means the entity is claiming you. You're bound to it now, and it's not going to stop until it takes what it wants." My heart sank, the weight of his words crashing down on me. I was trapped, bound to something I couldn't fight, couldn't escape. And I knew deep down that the worst was yet to come. The days after the attack were a waking nightmare. The symbol carved into the floorboard seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a constant reminder of the dark entity that had claimed me. The investigators, who had once exuded confidence, were now reduced to whispers and worried glances. They came and went, bringing in more equipment, performing more rituals, but nothing seemed to weaken the entity's hold. If anything, it seemed to be growing stronger. The bruises on my body deepened, turning an unnatural shade of black. The scratches too multiplied, each new one burning with a searing pain that refused to fade. I was physically and mentally exhausted, my sleep plagued by nightmares where shadowy figures dragged me down into a pit of darkness. Even when I was awake, I felt their presence lingering, watching, waiting. The investigators had made one thing clear. I was dealing with a force that was beyond their control. They spoke of ancient curses, of malevolent spirits that fed on fear and suffering. They warned me that the entity wouldn't stop until it had claimed me completely, until my very soul was consumed. But no one could tell me how to break free, how to rid myself of this curse. It was on the 7th night after the symbol appeared that everything came to a horrifying climax. The investigators had decided to stay with me, determined to confront the entity one last time. They brought with them a priest, a man of deep faith who had dealt with exorcisms before. He was calm, his voice steady as he recited prayers and sprinkled holy water throughout the flat. But beneath his calm exterior, I could sense his unease. The air in the flat was thick with tension, the silence oppressive. The priest instructed me to sit in the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of salt, while he and the investigators stood watch. The ritual was supposed to drive the entity out, to sever the connection that bound me to it. But as the minutes ticked by, the sense of dread only grew stronger, and then, without warning, the temperature dropped. It was as if every ounce of warmth had been sucked from the room, leaving behind an icy void. The priest's voice faltered, his prayers lost in the sudden cold. The lights flickered, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the flat, a sound so deep and primal that it seemed to vibrate through my bones. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, twisting and writhing as if alive. The figures reappeared, their forms darker, more defined than before. They slithered across the walls, creeping toward the circle of salt with a terrifying intent. The priest shouted a command, raising his crucifix high, but his voice was drowned out by the growling, by the whispers that returned in a chorus of malevolent voices. Leave or suffer. The figures lunged at the salt circle, but as they touched it, they recoiled with a hiss, the salt burning them like acid. They circled me, their movements frantic, as if searching for a weakness, an opening. I could feel the entity's rage, its frustration at being thwarted. But I also felt something else, a dark amusement as if it was toying with us, letting us believe we had the upper hand. The priest continued his prayers, louder now, more desperate. The investigators tried to keep the shadows at bay with their equipment, but it was clear that the entity was no longer playing by the rules. The shadows swarmed the room, blotting out the light, the walls, everything. I was engulfed in darkness, the air thick with the stench of decay. And then the growling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing down on us like a physical weight. The shadows retreated, pulling back into the corners, leaving the room in an eerie, unnatural calm. For a brief, fleeting moment, I dared to hope that it was over, that the entity had been banished. But then, I felt it. A cold, clammy hand gripping my ankle, yanking me down to the floor with a force that knocked the wind out of me. I screamed, the sound ripping from my throat as I was dragged across the floor out of the salt circle and into the heart of the darkness. The investigators rushed forward, shouting, trying to pull me back, but they couldn't break the entity's grip. I was hauled toward the corner of the room, where the shadows converged into a swirling, pulsating mass. The symbol on the floor flared to life, glowing with a sickly green light, and the whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices that filled my mind with terror. Submit, surrender, you are mine. The shadows enveloped me, wrapping around my body like a vice, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I could feel them pulling at me, tugging at my very essence, as if trying to rip my soul from my body. The pain was unbearable, a searing agony that made my vision blur, my thoughts scatter. But through the pain, through the terror, I heard something else. A voice, soft and distant, but unmistakable. It was my own voice, but it was twisted, distorted, filled with malice. "It's too late," the voice said, echoing in my mind. "You've always belonged to me." I didn't understand, couldn't comprehend what was happening. But as the shadows dragged me deeper into the darkness, the truth began to dawn on me, a horrifying realization that made my blood run cold. The entity wasn't just haunting me. It was me. I had been marked, bound to this malevolent force long before I ever set foot in that flat. It had been waiting, lurking in the depths of my mind, feeding on my fears, my doubts, my pain. And now it was taking control, merging with me, consuming me from the inside out. The investigators were powerless to stop it. I could see their faces, distorted by the darkness, their eyes wide with horror as they watched me disappear into the void. The priest was shouting, his prayers frantic, but the words meant nothing. The shadows swallowed me whole, the cold seeping into my very bones until there was nothing left but darkness. And then just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The shadows vanished, the room was silent, and I was gone. All that remained was the flat, empty, and lifeless, the symbol on the floor still glowing faintly in the dim light. The investigators stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The priest fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he clutched his crucifix, his eyes filled with tears. They had lost. The entity had won. But in the corner of the room, where the shadows had gathered, a figure began to emerge. A figure that looked exactly like me. It was smiling, a cold, malevolent smile that sent a shiver down the spines of everyone present. The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing with a sickly green light, and spoke in a voice that was both mine and not mine. "It's done," the figure said, its smile widening. "I'm free." The investigators backed away, terror etched on their faces as the figure, my doppelganger, walked past them through the flat and out the door. The priest tried to speak, tried to pray, but the words caught in his throat, choked by the horror of what he had seen. And as the figure disappeared into the night, leaving the flat behind, it began to laugh. A cold, hollow laugh that echoed through the empty streets of London. The entity had taken what it wanted, and now it was free to roam the world, wearing my face, using my voice, spreading its darkness wherever it went. And I, the real me, was trapped, lost forever in the shadows, my soul consumed by the very thing I had feared the most. The Battersea Poltergeist had won, and it would not rest until it had claimed more souls, more lives, more victims to torment. And the worst part? No one would ever know. The world would see me, hear me, but they would never know that the true horror was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its next victim.